You covered good ground today. But here's something most people still don't understand. Great empires are not built on blood. They are built on calories. And yet, while generals dreamed of glory, it was food that decided who lived and who died. The sunset is beautiful. But behind that beauty, an army of 100,000 men consumes a mountain of food in literally a matter of days. And here's the brutal truth. Hunger killed legionaries far more often and far more effectively than enemy swords or sharp spears ever could. That is why the Romans created a supply system that was centuries ahead of its time. Think about it. Ancient logistics should have been impossible without modern trucks, trains, or digital systems. And yet, 100,000 soldiers on the march became something terrifying, a gigantic moving city with an insatiable appetite. This aggressive city required daily deliveries of hundreds of tons of grain, meat, and fresh water. One delay, just one, meant catastrophe, meant collapse, meant death. Modern generals still study the logistical systems of Rome, because what they built was not just supply lines, it was a machine. A perfect, calculated system where mathematics decided survival. The Roman war machine operated like a living conveyor belt, transforming ordinary grain into unstoppable power on the battlefield. Wheat was the true fuel of the empire. Each legionnaire consumed about 1 kilogram of raw grain daily. Not bread, not luxury meals, just grain. Because they understood something most armies didn't: energy wins wars. Meat was secondary, sometimes even disliked, because Roman soldiers learned through brutal experience that complex carbohydrates gave them long-lasting endurance. Today, we call it carb loading. Back then, they called it survival. A grain-based diet stabilized energy, prevented exhaustion, and kept soldiers marching for miles under brutal conditions. Now imagine this scale: 100,000 soldiers required 100 tons of grain every single day. Even today, that number is staggering, and the army had only two choices: carry it or find it. So the Romans did something genius. They didn't distribute bread. They distributed raw grain. Every evening, exhausted soldiers ground their own flour using heavy hand mills. After marching all day, they worked again. Grinding, cooking, surviving. It wasn't just food preparation, it was discipline. It was training. It was control. Dry grain could last for years. Fresh food spoiled quickly. So Rome shifted the final burden of survival onto the soldiers themselves. Using that flour, they baked simple flatbread or cooked thick porridge known as poles. It looked like mortar. It tasted basic. But it saved lives. The quality of grain was strictly inspected. Rotten supplies were destroyed immediately. Because one sick soldier cost more than wasted food. And here's something powerful. Officers ate the same food as ordinary soldiers during campaigns. Because shared hardship builds unbreakable discipline. They drank pasca, a mix of water and sour wine. Strange but effective. It killed bacteria and kept soldiers hydrated. An ancient energy drink born from necessity. But this entire system had a weakness. Rome depended heavily on grain from Egypt and North Africa. If supply routes failed, the empire itself trembled. So protecting food routes became more important than winning battles, because without food there is no army. To move 100 tons daily, Rome relied on something simple but powerful: mules. Not horses. Not carts. Mules strong, enduring, efficient. Each could carry about 100 kg and travel up to 30 km a day. For every 10 soldiers there was one mule. Think about that. A massive caravan stretching for kilometers. Each animal carrying survival. Each soldier responsible for it. Losing a mule wasn't just a loss, it was a threat to the entire campaign. Because without transport, the army stops. And when an army stops, it dies. But here's where it gets even more intense. The Roman army didn't just move food. It built an entire system to control it. Across the empire, they constructed massive stone granaries, engineered for long-term storage. Ventilation, raised floors, protection from moisture and rats. Grain could last up to 2 years. Think about that level of planning. This wasn't just an army. This was an industrial system. 2,000 years before industry existed, warehouses were placed strategically across key routes. An army didn't wander blindly. It moved from supply point to supply point like clockwork. 5 days of marching between each base. Perfect spacing. Perfect timing. Perfect control. Each granary was guarded heavily, because losing even one could collapse an entire campaign. Everything was recorded. Every grain counted. Every ration tracked. Roman bureaucracy wasn't weakness. It was their secret weapon. While the army consumed supplies from the front, new supplies constantly arrived from the rear. a continuous flow, what we now call just-in-time logistics. Yes, Rome invented it long before modern corporations. But nature still controlled everything. Winter stopped war, mud blocked roads, storms sank ships. From November to March, everything slowed down. So commanders planned campaigns a year in advance. They bought grain early, stockpiled aggressively, prepared for disaster. Because one mistake meant famine, and famine meant something worse than defeat, mutiny. When supplies failed, the system collapsed fast. Rations were cut, energy dropped. Morale broke. Soldiers grew angry, then dangerous. Discipline faded. Orders were ignored. And sometimes armies turned on themselves. Generals used brutal punishments like decimation to restore order. But fear doesn't fill stomachs. So desperate soldiers did the unthinkable. They ate their own transport animals. Mules, horses, the very system that kept them alive. Saving today, destroying tomorrow. Disease followed quickly. Weak bodies, dirty conditions, deadly outbreaks. In the end, hunger killed what enemies could not. And enemies knew this. So they avoided battle. They simply waited. Because time was the deadliest weapon against Rome. That's why logistics became a religion. Every number mattered. Every groat mattered. Every grain mattered. Because wars weren't won on battlefields. They were won on dusty roads, inside warehouses, and in the hands of clerks. The Roman army functioned like a massive corporation. Structured, accountable, relentless. Soldiers lived in small groups of 8, sharing food, work, and survival. They cooked together, ate together, fought together. Because survival wasn't individual, it was collective. And this system created something terrifying: an army that could stay longer, march further, fight harder, while enemies starved. Rome didn't just fight wars. It outlasted them. It outfought them. It outorganized them. And in the end, that's why Rome dominated the ancient world. Not just because of swords, but because of bread. Because the army that eats is the army that wins. But even the most perfect system was never truly safe. Because war doesn't follow plans, and logistics breaks in silence. A single storm could sink entire fleets. A single fire could turn months of stored grain into useless ash. A single ambush could cut off an army from survival itself. And when that happened, the most disciplined army in the world faced its most terrifying enemy, uncertainty. Because no matter how powerful Rome was, it could not control nature. It could not control chance. And it could not control time. Supply caravans got delayed. Bridges collapsed. Roads disappeared into mud. Granaries burned. And suddenly, the unstoppable machine began to crack. At that moment, everything changed. The army switched into survival mode. Not conquest. Not glory. Just survival. Soldiers were sent out daily in organized foraging units. Not chaotic looters, but controlled search teams. Half the army stayed behind to guard the camp. The other half marched out searching for food. Every field. Every barn. Every hidden storage pit. Nothing escaped them. This process had a name: frumentatio. It was systematic, relentless, and often deadly. Because while Romans searched for food, the enemy waited. Foraging units were vulnerable, exposed. Perfect targets. Ambushes were common. Sudden attacks in forests, hills, and narrow paths. So even while searching for food, soldiers stayed in formation. Armed. Ready. Because every meal could cost a life. And here's the darker truth. Foraging wasn't just survival, it was destruction. The Romans didn't just take food. They erased it. Fields burned, storage destroyed, livestock seized, entire regions left empty. Because a land without food cannot resist. This was strategy. Cold, calculated, effective. The enemy didn't just lose battles, they lost the ability to fight at all. But even this system had limits. Because the more the army relied on foraging, the slower it became, the weaker it became, the more time it lost. And time was everything. An army busy searching for food cannot fight, cannot advance, cannot win. So campaigns stalled, momentum died, and the balance of power shifted, sometimes completely. And then came the final stage of desperation. When no food could be found and supplies were gone, the Roman army faced collapse. Soldiers hid food, stole from each other, broke discipline. Because hunger doesn't follow rules, it destroys them. Commanders responded with brutal force, strict punishments, public executions, total control. Because if discipline broke, the army died, not in battle, but from within. And yet, even in chaos, the system tried to survive. Every grain counted, every ration measured, every decision calculated. Because one extra day of food could mean the difference between survival and extinction. Now think about this. While soldiers fought on the front lines, Thousands of unseen workers kept them alive. Farmers, sailors, merchants, mule drivers, clerks. An entire hidden world feeding the war machine. Rome wasn't just an army, it was an ecosystem. A living network of resources, labor, and control. And this is what made it unstoppable. Not just strength, not just discipline, but coordination, precision, and relentless organization. Enemies could match Roman courage. They could match Roman weapons. But they could not match Roman logistics. And that changed everything. Because war is not about who fights hardest. It's about who lasts longer, who eats longer, who survives longer. And Rome mastered that better than anyone. That's why their legions could stay in enemy territory for months, while others collapsed in weeks. That's why they could fight on multiple fronts, while others struggled to feed one army. That's why they didn't just win battles, they controlled outcomes. In the end, the Roman Empire wasn't powered by glory. It wasn't powered by heroes. It wasn't even powered by war. It was powered by systems, by grain, by planning, by numbers, and by something most people ignore, logistics. Because behind every victory, there was a ledger. Behind every conquest, there was a supply line. And behind every invincible army, there was food. Take that away, and even the greatest empire in history becomes nothing more than a starving crowd.